It's time for Global Insight. Should you be allowed to record your phone calls without the consent of the other person? In South Korea, where most people use Samsung Galaxy phones, phone call recordings are easily done with a built-in recording button. While voice recordings are permitted as long as the person recording the conversation is part of the conversation, the issue here is that the person on the other end of the line may not be aware that their words are being recorded. So a group of lawmakers this month have proposed a change to revise South Korea's law on one-party consent in order to ramp up privacy protection in the country. But some may argue that they need those phone recordings not only for possible legal disputes, but also for work-related tasks and remembering details. We discussed the issue today with LEE Gyooho professor at Chung-Ang University School of Law and Dr. Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna, the Vice President for Global Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. Very warm welcome to you both. Professor Lee, well, let's start with the situation here in South Korea. First of all, why is phone call recording with this one-party consent system still allowed in South Korea, despite the country having some of the world's toughest privacy laws?
Actually, it is very important to promote equal protection and easy access to justice under the Korean Constitution. And in Korea, the recording of parties who participate in the conversations with others, even without their permission, is allowed under the Korean case law. Also, the recording of a conversation among others by a third party is allowed under very limited situations under the Act on the Protection of Communications and Secrets.
And Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna, well, in most parts of the world, including the US, phone call recordings, they are quite more restricted than it is here. They are in South Korea. And well, in the US, how do federal and state laws regulate the recordings of phone calls differently?
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation to weigh in on the issue. In the U.S., both state and federal laws may apply to recording phone calls. The federal standard is established by the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986, which governs the interception of calls for law enforcement purposes and imposes criminal penalties for the covered recording of calls by individuals who are not participants to such calls. However, the law does allow recording phone calls if at least one party to the conversation consents to it. This being said, the majority of states in the US follow indeed the same rule. However, there are also 11 states in the US which adopted state laws with stricter rules. They require that all parties to a phone call must consent for that recording to be legal. This happens in some of the biggest states in the US, such as California. The states that require all parties to a conversation to consent before a recording happens also provide for exceptions to this rule. California, which has one of the strictest state laws, allows for phone calls to be recorded with the consent of only one caller in some specific situations, such as when recording certain crimes or communications regarding such crimes and exceptions this extent. Elsewhere, and particularly in Europe, which is known for having some of the strictest privacy laws in the world, the rules also primarily require that all parties to a conversation consent to a recording for it to be legal.
And Professor Lee, well, in countries like England, phone call recording without consent is permitted for providing evidence to court for crime prevention or for business transaction purposes. And of course, in the States, as Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna just said, the rules differ by state. What do you think the laws in South Korea would look like or should look like if phone call recording becomes more restricted or even prohibited? Have there been any kind of discussion on this?
Yes, it's a very controversial issue. Even the recording of parties who participate in the conversation with others without with the permission, without permission is not allowed under the bill introduced the National Assembly. Some said it is to promote privacy and the secret of the conversation. But to me, it is definitely diminished the equal protection and the easy access to justice. So this is the now is very vivid, discussions.
And Professor Lee, if South Korean laws are amended to ban phone recording without permission, do you think the recording function on Galaxy phones, for instance, would they be disabled or removed, like it was the case with the iPhone?
Definitely is affecting, the industry. The Galaxy will remove phone call functions to avoid the potential criminal liability of users.
I see. And Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna, now, how about interstate or international phone calls? Let's say there are two states, there's a phone conversation in dispute. I mean, how would different laws apply on recording phone calls if there were to be such a conflict?
Well, this is a very complex issue, unfortunately, with no clear answer, especially in the international context, where applicable law will depend also on whether the phone call recordings are done for law enforcement or national security purposes, or whether the recordings are done by private parties. I would say a rule of thumb, though, for both interstate in the US and international phone calls is often to adhere to whatever is the strictest rule among the various jurisdictions involved in a call. For instance, we do have a case here from the Supreme Court of California holding that California's stricter law should prevail over Georgia's, another state here in the US, over Georgia's one-party consent rule for a case that involved a Georgia-based business routinely recording calls to California customers.
And Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna, what are the privacy concerns surrounding phone call recordings, and in what instances do you think they should be permissible without consent?
Well, breaching the privacy of communications is among the most serious privacy breaches out there. It is no coincidence that some of the oldest international human rights conventions, such as the UN Declaration on Human Rights or the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically include the protection of correspondence, so therefore communications within the right to respect for privacy. But then context matters a lot because different context comes with different expectations of privacy and confidentiality, as well as with different legitimate justifications for breaching the privacy of communications. For instance, there are different expectations of privacy when a person is having a phone conversation with their family, their partner, their children, and other expectations when the same person is having a conversation with the customer service of their favorite online shop, for example. There is also an enhanced expectation of confidentiality subject to professional obligations for secrecy, as well as very strict legal protections when a person is having a conversation with their lawyer or their doctor. There are questions of trust and transparency, aside from any specific legal obligation that go with the idea of surreptitiously recording another person's statements. And then, of course, there's the matter of recording a phone conversation, right? And then the different matter of disclosing it to a third party or to the world at large, which might bring additional harm to the persons involved.
Professor Lee, well, a few years ago, South Korea passed some of the world's strongest data protection laws, personal information protection laws. And how would phone call recordings be managed under these provisions?
So phone call the recordings of the parties to a conversation without permission are not relevant to PICA's data management provisions. Because they do not diminish people's right to self-determination of personal information. Also, another thing I need to mention is the Act on the Protection of Communications Secret takes precedence over the PICA.
And Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna, now with the growing use of video content on social media and also video calls on platforms like the one we're using now, what are the new risks to privacy being posed?
Well, going back to the Electronic Communications Privacy Act in the United States, the act applies to video calls as well as phone calls and other forms of electronic communication. But then, of course, video calls can reveal more details about the callers than standard voice-only calls, which in turn increases privacy risks. By nature, video calls likely include an image of each caller and also can often show details of the caller's physical locations, which may include professional offices, as well as, more often than not, their personal homes. So the privacy risks increase with the amount of the additional personal information that is being recorded and disclosed.
And Professor Lee, South Korea has very stringent standards on privacy, including the right to portrait or the right to face, or 초상권 in Korean. With the growing use of video on social media, do you expect to see a renewed discussion on this?
A bill to set a code was introduced to the National Assembly to confirm the personal rights based on the portrait, the name, and the voice, which are already allowed under the Korean court cases. Also, a bill to Copyright Act was introduced to the Korean National Assembly to recognize publicity rights. So, to me, I think the first bill will be introduced, safely in Korea. But the second one, the latter one, is a tough way to be introduced in Korea.
I see. And Professor, how do you expect the South Korean Parliament to really deal with this kind of bill? How much of a priority do you think it's going to be in the weeks to come? That's to you, Professor Lee. So we appear to have a fault with the video connection there. Turning to you, Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna. Now, what are some privacy issues that we really need to deal with even further, more elaborately, as we see the development of the metaverse and also social media just becoming more video-based these days?
The privacy risks are indeed increasing, and when we're talking about the metaverse, that is an entirely new, different universe of problems, issues that we might consider, in addition to, of course, all of the benefits that developing this new technology bring. When we're talking about the metaverse, or as we refer to it at the Future of Privacy Forum, immersive technology that requires AR, augmented reality devices, or virtual reality type of technology, we will be seeing incredible, even more massive amounts of personal information being collected. And we will be seeing gait, movement of irises being recorded from the users that are entering the metaverse, right, using the immersive technology. As I was saying in my previous intervention, the more personal information is being collected about an individual, the more privacy risks we are seeing. That's why one of the fundamental principles of data protection laws, which is recognized in most of the general data protection laws around the world, is data minimization. Because if we collect only the personal information that we need for a particular purpose, this will decrease the risk that unnecessary personal information is being disclosed out there or used for nefarious purposes.
Right, and would you say that the big tech corporations, Dr. Zanfir-Fortuna, such as Facebook or Meta rather, or all these platforms, do you think they're doing enough to make this kind of process more transparent in terms of how they're storing the data and also scrapping it when necessary?
I think all of the big tech players in this space are taking these issues very seriously, and my sense is that everybody has learned from the first age of using big data and the first age of social media that privacy risks must be dealt with from the get-go, from the beginning, from the time of designing a particular tech product. I think that from what I'm seeing, this is taken very seriously, and I am expecting indeed to see more transparency, but more than transparency, the expectations are very high to have privacy and data protection safeguards baked into the product as they are being developed. I think we are in a good place to seeing that happening, given that a lot of attention of regulators right now is on not only the big tech, but also all of the new technologies that require processing of personal data.
I see. Well, this is where we'll have to end the conversation today. That was LEE Gyooho Professor at Chung-Ang University School of Law and Dr. Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna, the Vice President for Global Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.